Some stories aren't meant to be told. Some names carry too much weight, and some doors, once open, never fully close again. I thought I could walk away from Scientology quietly. I thought I could forget the faces, the rules, and the night I met Tom Cruise. But the truth followed me, and what they told me before I left still haunts me to this day. They said I was already marked. The first thing I remember about Scientology wasn't a ceremony, a book, or even a face. It was the light, a single ceiling light that buzzed faintly overhead, pouring down on a spotless white room. The walls were too clean, unnaturally so, like they'd been scrubbed over and over until not a trace of the people before me remained. The air had a chill that didn't belong in Los Angeles. And when I reached out to steady myself, I noticed there was nothing soft in that room. No carpet, no curtains, not even a pillow on the narrow bed against the wall. I don't remember walking into that place. I don't remember signing papers, carrying a bag, or anyone shaking my hand at the door. All I remember is opening my eyes and realizing I was already there. And taped to the only door out of the room was a strip of paper with one sentence typed in blocky, uneven letters. Knock 3 times. Always 3. That was my instruction. No welcome packet, no explanation, no introductions. Just that rule. The first night, I woke up disoriented, my throat dry, my chest tight. I tried to push the door open, but it didn't budge, so I did what the paper said. I raised my fist and knocked. 3 times, no more, no less. The sound barely finished echoing when the handle turned. The door opened and a woman appeared. She was dressed head to toe in white. Her clothes were seamless. No buttons, no zippers, nothing that could snag or reveal where the garment began or ended. Her face was blank. Her hair pulled back so tightly it was as though it had been sculpted. She didn't speak. She didn't ask what I needed. She simply turned and started walking. Something in me knew to follow. The hallway outside was long, its walls bare, the paint too smooth, too even. I followed her down until we reached a tiled bathroom. She pointed at the door and then stood perfectly still as I entered. No words, no questions, just silence. When I stepped back out, she was gone. The hallway stretched in both directions, empty, the air faintly metallic, almost like blood on a coin. I found my way back to my room by instinct more than memory. Over the next few days, I realized everything in that house operated the same way. Knocks, silent guides, long white corridors that led you exactly where they wanted you to go. I never saw anyone speak to each other. Even the women in white who floated through the halls didn't whisper, didn't laugh, didn't sigh. Their footsteps barely touched the ground, leaving faint indentations on the carpet that vanished before my eyes, like the house itself swallowed evidence of their passing. What unsettled me most wasn't the silence, though. It was the absence of mirrors. At first, I didn't notice. I was too focused on adjusting, on finding my bearings. But after a week or two, I realized I hadn't seen my own face once since waking up there. The bathroom had a sink, but no mirror above it. The halls had cameras above every door, tiny red lights blinking like watchful eyes, but nothing that reflected back who I was. One night, I pressed my palms against the cold window of my room, straining to see even a faint outline of myself in the glass. The night was too dark, the angle too wide. It was like my face had been erased. And then there was the painting. Every morning when I walked down the hall to what they called lessons, I passed it. A girl in a white dress stood in the frame, her back turned to the viewer. She had the same rigid posture they forced us to practice. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, arms tucked neatly at her sides. For weeks, I told myself it was just a painting, just decoration. But the longer I looked at it, the more I wondered if it was supposed to be me. Or maybe one of the other silent girls drifting through the house. Sometimes I thought I saw her shoulders tighten, like she was listening to my footsteps as I walked past. The house wasn't empty. I could feel that much. Even when the halls looked deserted, there was a presence behind the walls. Sometimes at night, when I was too restless to sleep, I'd hear the faintest sound. Clapping. Not loud, not joyous, just 2 or 3 soft beats, like someone signaling an end. And then silence again. Later, I would learn what that sound meant. It wasn't praise. It was a cue. Everywhere I went, cameras followed, mounted above doors, tucked in corners, embedded in ceilings. Their red lights blinked rhythmically, like heartbeats. It wasn't surveillance the way you picture security footage. It was ritual, as though every blink was counting, measuring, recording not just where we went, but how long we stayed, how we moved, whether we obeyed. The only sounds I could never escape were the faint hum of the ceiling lights and, once in a while, a voice that slipped through hidden speakers. Calm, smooth, always familiar. Obedience is legacy. You were chosen because you are silent. I didn't know who the voice belonged to back then. I only knew that everyone treated it as law. The first time I encountered the others was in what passed for a dining hall. They dressed me in white like the rest of them, though my uniform never fit quite right. Too long at the sleeves, too stiff at the collar, like it had been made for someone else. The table stretched almost the length of the room, covered in gold plates and silver cutlery that gleamed unnaturally under the chandelier's yellow light. 5 women in white sat perfectly straight, their eyes fixed ahead, hands folded in their laps. None of them looked at me. None of them moved. And then the door opened. The man they called their leader entered and sat at the head of the table. He wore black, every inch of him immaculate, as though he were sculpted from the absence of light itself. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't even look at me at first. He just raised a hand slightly, and one of the women pulled out the chair beside him for me. I sat. The food before us was salmon, already plated, already cold. No one picked up their utensils. No one shifted in their seats. The air itself seemed to freeze as we waited. Finally, I heard it. The single word, spoken softly, almost casually. Eat! My hand hovered over the fork, heavy and wrong in its shine. I didn't move. One of the women to my left lifted her utensil mechanically and chewed without tasting. Then another followed and another until all of them were eating like machines. I still didn't move. That was when the man finally turned his head toward me. His smile wasn't warm. It wasn't even human. It was precise, practiced. A shape that looked right but carried no life behind it. He leaned close and whispered 2 words that chilled me more than any shouted command ever could. Good girl. And in that moment, I understood something. Silence wasn't just expected here. It was demanded. And the longer I stayed in that house without mirrors, without names, without voices, the more I realized silence itself was the performance. The morning it happened, I didn't need an alarm. I woke before the overhead light flickered on, my body already tense, waiting for something I couldn't name. The room felt heavier that day, as though the air itself was pressing against my chest. On the tray beside my bed was breakfast, the usual dry toast, a cup of water, and a folded piece of fabric. Only this time, it wasn't a dress. It was a ribbon. White, plain, and too clean. Its edges sharp against my fingertips. I knew what it meant before anyone told me. I had watched every girl before me receive hers. The ribbon was a summons. Once it appeared, you didn't ask questions. You didn't refuse. You went. And you came back different. No one came to guide me this time. No footsteps in the hall, no silent figure to lead the way. I was expected to know. The house had a way of teaching you things without ever saying them out loud. My legs moved before my mind caught up, carrying me down the hallway that seemed narrower than I remembered. The walls pressed in closer with every step, the hum of the lights deepening into something like a pulse. At the far end, I saw it. An open doorway, glowing red. It wasn't a steady light. It didn't blink like the cameras. It breathed. It swelled and dimmed, as though the walls themselves were alive and exhaling through color. The room was empty, except for a chair in the center, directly under a red spotlight. Its surface gleamed faintly, too polished, like metal disguised as wood. I didn't sit. Not yet. The air was thicker inside, dense enough that every breath tasted heavy, like syrup filling my lungs. My skin prickled as though unseen hands were hovering just above me, close enough to feel but never touching. And then I saw him. Through a pane of glass on the other side of the room, he sat watching. Not Tom Cruise, he would come later, but another figure of authority. He leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, elbows resting lightly on the armrests. His eyes never blinked. He didn't smile. He studied me the way a person studies an experiment they already know the outcome of. But it wasn't him that froze me in place. It was what stood behind him. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow caught in the red glow. But shadows aren't supposed to lean forward. They aren't supposed to smile. This one did. Its head tilted unnaturally, as though carved into place. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, like dying embers that had never cooled. And its grin wasn't for him. It was for me. I sat without meaning to. My legs folded into the chair as though commanded by something I couldn't hear. The moment my weight settled, the door behind me hissed shut, sealing out the hallway. The light above brightened, pulsing harder, making the air feel colder, sharper, almost metallic on my tongue. And then came the sound. 3 tones, low and mechanical, rising in order like an electronic chime. We had heard those tones before in lessons. They were never explained, just played at odd intervals, forcing us to pause whatever we were doing and wait. Now I knew why. They were signals, cues. The tones faded, leaving silence that pressed harder than any noise. My fingers twitched against the armrest. My thoughts began skipping, fragments breaking apart like stones tossed across black water. I wanted to scream. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. The red light dimmed slowly until it was the only thing left in the room. And then, nothing. That's where memory ends. When I woke up, I was back in my bed. My body was clean, my hair combed, a fresh dress folded neatly at the foot of the bed. For a moment, I could have convinced myself it had all been a dream, except for the echo inside me. Something I couldn't see or name, but could feel in the hollow of my chest. I checked my arms, my legs, searching for bruises or marks. Nothing. No proof of anything at all. But when I walked past the other girls in the hall that morning, I felt it. They knew. Their eyes slid over me without looking, but there was recognition there. They had all come back with that same stillness. Not calm, not peace. The stillness of forgetting something too heavy to carry. From that day on, I was different. Not because I remembered what happened in that room, but because I didn't. Something else had been inside me during that blackout. Something that had borrowed me for its own performance. And when it left, it hadn't gone all the way. It stayed. At night, I began to draw. It wasn't deliberate. My hands moved on their own, sketching shapes I didn't recognize. Spirals folded in on themselves, hallways that curved the wrong way, doors that opened into nothing. And sometimes, faces, not human ones. The mouth too wide, the eyes absent hollows, the skin pulled too tight. The face of the thing that had smiled at me from behind the glass. I learned something then that no one ever said out loud. Whatever happened in the red room wasn't about us performing. It was about making space inside of us for something else to perform through. And I wasn't sure I had left it behind when I walked out of that room. After the red room, life didn't go back to what it had been before, at least not for me. Outwardly, the routine was identical. Wake at dawn, dress in white, eat the same carefully portioned meals at the same cold table. Sit in posture training sessions until your muscles screamed. Walk through the same silent corridors lined with cameras that never blinked out of rhythm. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside, everything was different. It wasn't just the drawings that disturbed me. It was the way my hands seemed to move without my permission when I closed my eyes. Sketches of places I'd never seen but somehow knew. Symbols that twisted in on themselves until they seemed to vibrate on the page, like the paper itself was pulsing under the pencil. When I forced myself to look, the lines were chaotic, meaningless. But when I let my eyelids sink shut, when I surrendered to that echo inside me, the images became sharp, deliberate. They weren't mine, and yet they were coming through me.
The worst night was when I opened my eyes mid-sketch. The pencil dropped from my fingers, rolling onto the floor, because standing in the doorway was not just him, the man in black, but the figure I had drawn over and over without meaning to. The shadow with the ember eyes. It stood beside him like it had followed him out of the red room, its grin stretched impossibly wide, as if proud I had remembered its face. My breath caught. My body wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt as if the walls themselves were waiting to hear what I would do. Neither of them spoke. The man simply watched me with that calm, unreadable patience, while the thing beside him leaned, tilting its head like a predator curious about its prey. Then without a sound, they were gone. The hall outside my door was empty. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. The house had been training me all along to obey, to sit, to wait, to perform, to forget. But now I understood the truth. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about making sure there was no memory to begin with. And once I realized that, staying meant letting the silence swallow me forever. So I ran. It wasn't planned. I didn't stash food or map the hallways. I just acted. My bare feet hit the cold floor, carrying me through corridors that had always been closed to me before. This time, doors that should have been locked gave way. No alarms blared. No guards came.
It was like the house wanted to see how far I would get. Like it was part of the performance, too. I passed the painting of the girl in white, her back still turned, and for the first time, I wanted to scream at it, to spin the frame and force her to look at me, but I kept going. The air smelled sharper, like lemon cut with iron, the closer I got to the back halls. I expected hands to grab me. I expected the man's voice in the walls. Instead, there was nothing. Silence so complete it rang in my ears. The service hallway was narrow, unfinished. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping condensation onto the concrete floor. My steps echoed for the first time since I'd arrived, the sound bouncing too loud, as if to announce my every move. My heart hammered as I turned a corner, then another, until I reached the gate. And there it was. Open. A soft mechanical hum vibrated through the frame, like the gates had been waiting for me. Beyond them stretched gravel, a sloping path into the darkness of a tree line. No guards, no lights, just night. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was too easy. And that was what terrified me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Some part of me knew that if I did, I'd see him standing there in the doorway. The man in black with that rehearsed smile, or worse, the shadow grinning beside him. So I kept walking, faster than running, until my legs gave out. I collapsed into the backyard of a stranger's house, curling beneath a patio table as if the thin metal could protect me from what I'd left behind. By dawn, I was found. A woman spotted me trembling in her yard and called for help. When they asked who I was, I gave a name that didn't feel like mine. The name I'd arrived with was gone, and the one they'd assigned me felt hollow, like it belonged to a mask rather than a person. I had no ID, no paperwork. The only thing in my possession was the sketchbook I refused to let go of, its pages filled with faces no one else should ever see. At the hospital, they tried to take it from me. I clutched it so tightly my knuckles ached, and eventually they gave up. For the first time in years, someone looked at me as if I were human, not a variable in an experiment. But even then, I knew the house wasn't finished with me. Because escaping the building didn't mean I had escaped the mark. You would think the moment I stumbled into the outside world, the nightmare would have cracked open, that someone would have called the police, that my name would have been shouted across news channels, listed on missing persons reports, plastered on telephone poles. You would think there'd be outrage. But the strangest part about leaving wasn't the fear of being chased. It was the silence. No one came looking for me. Not the so-called guardians from the house, not security, not even the nameless women who had watched us in white silence every day. Days turned into weeks. I sat in the hospital with a social worker who asked gentle questions and tapped at her clipboard. But every answer I gave unraveled into nothing. Where had I come from? I couldn't say. How long had I been there? I didn't know. Did I have parents? Family? Friends? My lips moved, but nothing came out that made sense. I started watching the news, waiting for something, anything. A report of a runaway, a raid, even a whisper about the strange house hidden in plain sight. But nothing surfaced. No cameras had caught me leaving. No reports filed. It was as if the house had swallowed me whole and then spat me out without leaving a trace behind. The only proof I had was the sketchbook. Its pages were already worn, the edges curling from the way I clutched it each night like it was a lifeline. I filled more of it in those first weeks outside, sometimes without realizing I was drawing. Spirals that seemed to fold into each other endlessly, faces half-formed, stretched too tight, smiling too wide. I buried the book under blankets when nurses came in, terrified they would see, terrified they would take it. For a while, I tried to pretend I was normal. Grocery stores, television at night, city buses with strangers who didn't know my name. But the house followed me in ways I couldn't explain. Every so often, I'd catch a flash of black in a crowded street, a stillness at the corner of my room when I turned off the lights. I'd wake at 3 a.m., convinced the air was breathing again, pulsing with that same red rhythm I had left behind. And then, one evening at a gas station, I saw the headline scroll across the screen above the cash register. Federal investigation into Scientology expands. New witnesses emerge. Tom Cruise, silent. My body froze, but not from surprise, from recognition. It wasn't news to me that something monstrous lived inside that so-called church. It wasn't news that people disappeared, that silence was demanded, that faces were erased. What hit me was the way his name appeared there, tied to it like a banner. Tom Cruise, the face of their empire. I had seen his smile on posters, in interviews, and glossy promotional footage. But now, seeing it in the same sentence as investigation and witnesses, I understood something sickening. The silence I had endured wasn't just ritual, it was protection. Not for us, for them, for him, for the brand. The stories came like whispers at first. Podcasts, late night radio, YouTube commentaries. People who claimed to have known someone inside. People who insisted they had been followed, threatened, erased when they tried to leave. And threaded through all of it was his presence. Tom Cruise at ceremonies, Tom Cruise at recruitment drives, Tom Cruise meeting the newest chosen. When I saw his face on a television interview weeks later, my stomach turned. Not because of what he said, but because of what I saw behind his smile. That same rehearsed precision I'd seen in the man in black at the head of the table. Too exact, too smooth, as if it had been practiced in a mirror not to express joy, but to mimic it. That was when the phrase first came back to me. The words I'd overheard whispered in the hallways when I still lived inside. She's next. The red room's ready. Back then, it was a sentence that made my stomach twist. But now, out here, it meant something else. It meant the rituals weren't confined to the house I had escaped. They stretched far wider, embedded into every smiling face they put in front of cameras. I realized then that I hadn't left anything behind. I had carried it out with me. Or maybe it had carried me. And that was when I understood what it meant to be marked. Because when I tried to leave Scientology, they didn't chase me. They didn't have to. The mark was already there, in the silence, in the sketches, in the recognition of those faces on the screen, and in the knowledge that Tom Cruise, the man the world worshipped as a star, had once stood in the same rituals, breathing the same red light, smiling the same smile that wasn't real. The first time I met Tom Cruise, it didn't feel real. It didn't feel like meeting a person at all. It felt like stepping into a scene that had already been written long before I arrived, as if I was just playing a role someone else had scripted for me. It happened at one of their celebrations. That's what they called them, celebrations. They were never labeled as meetings, never ceremonies, never anything that hinted at the rigidity behind them. Always celebrations, as though adding confetti to the word could disguise what was really happening. I remember the room most of all. Bright,
pristine, draped in banners printed with the familiar golden symbols of Scientology. Rows of chairs perfectly aligned, faces smiling too hard, eyes watching too closely. It smelled faintly of lemon again, but underneath was that metallic tang, the one that always made me think of the house, of the red room, of the thing that smiled behind glass. When he entered, the atmosphere shifted instantly. People rose to their feet without being told. The clapping started before he even stepped onto the platform, a mechanical rhythm like the synchronized chewing at that long white table. Tom Cruise smiled that famous smile, teeth gleaming, eyes bright with a charm that the outside world would call magnetic. But standing there in person, it felt rehearsed, perfectly timed, too exact to be real. And then, somehow, his eyes landed on me. For a moment, it was as if the crowd dissolved. He crossed the stage, his hand extended, his voice ringing with practiced warmth. "There you are," he said, as though he had known me all along. The words shouldn't have meant anything. They were casual, meaningless. But the way he said them, the weight behind them, told me otherwise. There you are. As if he had been waiting. As if my presence wasn't a coincidence, but a continuation. When his hand touched mine, something in me shifted. A cold vibration ran up my arm, sharp and precise, as though my body had remembered a signal I didn't know I had learned. For the briefest second, I saw a flash, not of him, but of the thing that had stood behind the glass in the red room, its ember eyes glowing, its grin stretched too wide. And then it was gone, replaced by Tom Cruise's dazzling smile, his laughter filling the room as he clasped my shoulder like we were old friends. The others looked on with envy and awe, their faces lit with something I recognized all too well, belief. But I didn't feel awe, I felt recognition. The same way I'd recognized the rehearsed smile of the man in black. The same way I'd recognized the silence of the women in white. I recognized this. Tom Cruise wasn't just a believer. He was part of the performance. Later that evening, they told me what I already knew deep down. One of the handlers approached me quietly, their voice low, their eyes too calm. "You've been marked," they said. The phrase sent a shiver through me, though the words themselves were simple. Marked. It didn't mean chosen. It didn't mean saved. It meant claimed. I asked what that meant, but no one explained. Instead, they just smiled that same empty smile and moved on, as though I had been given an answer I should already understand. And in a way, I did. Because after meeting him, after hearing his voice echo in my chest like the hum of the red light, I realized the mark wasn't something you could see. It wasn't a tattoo or a scar. It was the knowledge, the memory of what had been done, what had been rehearsed, what had been whispered behind glass. Once you saw it, once you carried it, there was no leaving. That was the horror of it. Not that they would chase me if I ran. Not that they would drag me back, but that the performance never ended. Once you'd played your part, once you'd stood under the red light, once you'd shaken the hand of the star who carried their image across the world, you belonged to them. And no matter how far you walked, you carried that mark with you. After that night, after his hand closed around mine, and the handlers whispered the word that had been waiting for me all along, I thought I could shake it off. I told myself I was free.
I told myself that outside of those walls I could choose silence or speech. But it didn't take long to learn that being marked wasn't a label you could peel away. It was something that lived under your skin, humming quietly like a second pulse.
It began with small things. Walking down a crowded street and suddenly noticing a stillness, a gap where people should have been moving. A man in a black jacket lingering too long at the corner. A woman across the subway aisle staring with eyes that didn't blink. At first, I tried to explain it away. Coincidence, paranoia. Maybe I was seeing patterns where none existed. But then, late at night, I would feel it again. That faint vibration, like the hum of the red light in the walls of the house, running through my body as if some unseen signal had reached me.
And the sketches returned. I had locked the sketchbook away, told myself I'd never touch it again. But my hands didn't listen. In the quiet hours when the city outside my window had gone still, I would find myself holding a pencil without remembering picking it up. The pages filled with spirals again, symbols I didn't understand but recognized. And always the face, no eyes, skin stretched too tight, mouth pulled too wide. The grin that had waited for me behind glass.
I wasn't alone in the silence. That much became clear. On one occasion, I caught a news segment about another former member of Scientology who had tried to speak out. She didn't last long. One interview, one shaky confession about missing days, about sessions she couldn't remember, and then she disappeared from public view. No follow-up, no second appearance, just gone. The anchors moved on as if she'd never existed.
That was the part that haunted me most. Not the threat of violence, not the idea that they would drag me back to the house, but the possibility of erasure. Being marked meant you didn't belong to yourself anymore. It meant your story, your presence, your identity, all of it could be dissolved into silence whenever they chose.
And then there were the whispers. At first, they came only in dreams. Voices low, familiar, threading through my sleep until I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. Obedience is legacy. You were chosen because you are silent. The same words from the walls of the house replayed like an echo I could never escape. But then the whispers slipped into waking life. I would be in a grocery store, a stranger passing too close in the aisle, and I'd hear it.
3 words muttered under their breath. Not to me, not even directed, just spoken. She's marked.
That was when I understood that the mark wasn't only in me. It was in them too. The handlers, the believers, the ones who carried the silence forward like a contagion. It was a language without language, a system of recognition that didn't need paperwork or identification. And Tom Cruise was everywhere. His face filled billboards, movie trailers, magazine covers. Each time I saw him, it was like a reminder, a signal. The world saw a hero, a star, a man of impossible stunts and dazzling smiles. I saw something else. I saw the reflection of the red room in his eyes, the echo of that hum in his voice. Every interview, every speech, every laugh carried the weight of the performance. He wasn't acting in films. He was acting for them. That was the horror of being marked. The world looked normal. People cheered for him, bought tickets, clapped their hands in theaters. But for me, every poster, every screen, every smile was a reminder that I hadn't escaped at all. The performance followed me, and silence was the only role left for me to play. There's a moment after you've carried a secret too long where your body almost forces it out. It builds inside you like pressure. like something pushing against your ribs, begging for release. That's what it felt like the first time I tried to tell someone what happened to me inside Scientology. I had convinced myself that speaking it out loud would be enough to break the spell. That once the words left my lips, I would finally be free of the mark. I started small. I told a nurse at the clinic where I'd been assigned follow-up care. She had kind eyes, the kind of smile that looked practiced, but still human. One afternoon, I found myself blurting it out. Not all of it, just a sliver. I told her I'd been held somewhere, that the walls had cameras, that I'd been forced into a room with red lights. Her smile faltered. She glanced at her clipboard, then back at me. "That sounds troubling," she said gently. "But maybe it was a dream. Trauma can make us imagine things." She scribbled something down I couldn't see. When I asked later to see my file, that page was missing. Next, I tried the media. A small podcast that claimed to investigate cults and secret societies. I typed out an email at 2 a.m, fingers shaking, pouring out details about the house, the red room, the silence. I hit send, heart racing with relief. Finally, someone would hear me. Finally, someone would know. 2 days later, the email bounced back with a cold automated message. Address not found. The podcast still uploaded weekly. It wasn't gone. Only my message was. I tried again with a journalist who had written a critical piece on Scientology years earlier. This time, I received a reply. 2 lines. "Thank you for reaching out. Please don't contact me again." That was when I realized the silence wasn't just inside the house. It stretched out here too. Out in the world. A system so vast and efficient, it could erase words before they were ever truly spoken. The most chilling moment came when I finally broke down and told a friend. Not a stranger, not a professional. Someone I trusted. We sat in her kitchen late at night, the hum of the refrigerator filling the pauses as I described the white hallways, the painting of the girl in the dress, the smile that wasn't human. She listened without interrupting, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When I finished, she nodded slowly, then stood to pour herself another glass of water. "You shouldn't talk about this," she said without turning around. Her voice was steady, too steady. "It's better if you forget." The words sent a chill through me because they weren't hers. They were the same cadence, the same tone as the voice in the walls. "You were chosen because you were silent." I left her house and never went back. From then on, I stopped trusting anyone. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know who carried the silence with them. It wasn't about loyalty or fear. It was about recognition. The mark was invisible, but once you had it, others knew. The way a glance lingered too long. The way a conversation cut short just before you reached the truth. The way doors closed quietly, politely, with no explanation. And threaded through all of it was him, Tom Cruise. Each time he appeared in the media, I felt the pressure return. He was the beacon, the public face, the untouchable star who smiled while the rest of us carried silence like chains. And every time I saw that smile, I wondered, how many others had tried to speak? How many had their words erased before anyone could hear them? How many had sat in that red room before me, only to be told they were marked forever? I began to understand then that silence wasn't just protection for the church. It was its greatest weapon. The performance wasn't inside the house. The performance was out here in plain sight.
where millions applauded, laughed, and cheered, never realizing the stage had been built on silence.
And the mark meant that even outside, I was still part of the act.
For months, my life existed in that strange tension between silence and exposure. I had tried to speak and been erased. I had tried to live normally and been haunted. But then the world itself began to shift, ever so slightly.
The first signs came in headlines that scrolled across the bottom of television screens. Scientology under federal scrutiny. New allegations. Surface. Witnesses come forward. At first, the stories were vague. Financial irregularities. Lawsuits filed quietly in states where the church operated under the radar. Nothing that touched the truth. Nothing that spoke of the rooms without mirrors, the red light, the rehearsed smiles. But it was a beginning. I watched the coverage obsessively, clinging to every word, every soundbite. Podcasts dissected documents. Journalists speculated about hidden funds. Commentators argued over whether celebrities tied to Scientology would finally face questions. Tom Cruise's name appeared more and more often, always with a photograph attached. His dazzling grin, his perfect posture, the very image of charm and confidence. To the world, he looked untouchable. To me, every time I saw him, I felt the mark on me hum. A reminder that we were bound by something invisible and unspeakable. And then something happened that confirmed what I had feared. During one court segment, as reporters flipped through slides of evidence, a sketch appeared briefly on the screen. It wasn't mine, but it could have been. A girl in white, her back turned, her face erased. The same posture, the same stillness, the same silence I had lived. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I thought the neighbors might hear.
Someone else remembered. Someone else had drawn what we weren't supposed to. For the first time since I left, I didn't feel alone. But the mark reminded me of its presence almost immediately. That night, as I tried to sleep, the whispers returned. Not from dreams, but from the very air in my room. Obedience is legacy. You were chosen because you are silent. Louder this time. Closer. I pressed my palms to my ears, but it didn't matter. The words weren't coming from outside. They were inside, woven into the echo the red room had left behind. And then there were the faces. I began to notice them again in crowds, at bus stops, in waiting rooms. A woman folding her newspaper too neatly. A man in line at the grocery store with a smile that never touched his eyes. They never spoke. They didn't have to. I knew what they were. Watchers. Silent reminders that leaving had never really meant leaving.
But the cracks in the facade grew wider. More women stepped forward with fragments of their stories. Some described sessions they couldn't remember. Others spoke of being isolated, silenced, instructed to perform rituals they didn't understand. None of them told the full truth, at least not publicly. But I could hear it in the gaps, in the words they didn't say. They had been there too. The investigators circled closer, subpoenas whispered in news reports, sealed documents leaked on obscure websites. And through it all, Tom Cruise remained silent. His absence was loud. The star who had always spoken for them, always stood at the front of their stages, said nothing, and that nothing spoke louder than any denial could have. I realized then that the mark wasn't just a curse. It was also a responsibility, because the silence that protected them was the same silence that damned us. And if the cracks were spreading, if the truth was finally trying to claw its way out, then maybe, just maybe,
Breaking my silence could widen them enough to bring it all down. But that's the paradox of being marked. The moment you decide to speak is the moment you feel the weight of the performance most, as if the red room itself is leaning closer, waiting to see whether you'll remember the lines you were taught or dare to write new ones.